In this video, we're going to look at the stems and the roots, look at their structure and how their structure is well suited to carry out their functions. So we'll start with stems. So stems have two main roles in a plant. They're going to support the plant in order to hold those leaves up to the light so they can do photosynthesis. And they're going to transport water and nutrients around the plant. So if we look at a cross section of a stem, we can see various structures within it. So on the outside, just like the leaves, there is a cuticle, and then inside of that is an epidermis. Inside of the epidermis is a region of ground tissue called the cortex, and then in the middle of the stem is the pith, and we'll talk about what the cortex and the pith do in a minute. Then you have vascular bundles or veins that are arranged in a ring around the stem. And the veins are made up of xylem and phloem. And then in between the xylem and phloem, there's a layer of something called cambium. And so cambium is essentially a meristem region, right? So it's going to produce undifferentiated cells that can mature into either new xylem or new phloem. So it helps grow the stem and make it wider around. So now let's look at the function. So there were the two functions of the stem. So the support role and the transport role. So starting with the support role. So when a plant is properly hydrated, so it has enough water, water gets stored in the cells of the pith and the cortex. And so the high water pressure within those cells causes them to expand, which creates something called cell turgor, which keeps the stem upright. Okay, so you get turgid cells when you have enough water. The water enters into the cell and it goes into that central vacuole, which swells and pushes against the cell wall. And that keeps the stem upright. Whereas if there isn't enough water, water leaves the cell, that vacuole shrinks, the cell loses shape, and the stem gets droopy. Right? So you might have noticed if you have some plants in your home, they're kind of droopy, you water them, they start to stand up straighter. And that's because you're creating turgor pressure within those cells and helping the stem to stand up straight. So also in terms of the support role of the stem, so some cells within that stem have a thickened cell wall. So it's not the usual size, it's thicker, and this makes the stem stronger. And also the cell walls of xylem contain a large complex polymer called lignin, and this makes the stem even stronger. And so we've got those thick cell walls, and then they're what's called lignified. They contain lignin, which is a very strong substance and helps keep the stem upright. Now moving on to the nutrient transport role of the stem. So the vascular tissue within the stem has three main fluid conducting functions. So it's going to conduct water and minerals from the roots up to the leaves, and that's carried out by the xylem. It's going to conduct any newly manufactured food molecules that are being made of the leaves. It's going to conduct those to any part that needs it, or it'll conduct them to the roots so they can be stored, and that's a function of phloem. And that food that's stored in the root, the stem will conduct that food to any part of the plant that needs it, and that's also a function of phloem. So moving on to modified stems. So first, there are things called stolons or runners. You may have heard of runners. These are above ground horizontal stems that produce a new plant wherever the nodes in the stem touch the ground. Okay, and this is the most common one that I could think of is strawberry plants send out these runners, right? So the stem goes out, and where it touches the ground, you start to form a new plant. Another type of modified stem are tubers. So these are enlarged regions of underground stems that are used for food storage. So they're underground, so you might think they're a root, but they're actually a stem because they have those vascular bundles arranged in a ring. And as we'll see in a minute, roots don't have that structure. So these are modified stems. And so an example of a tuber is a potato. So a potato is actually a stem. So now moving on to the roots. So the major roles of the roots are to anchor the plant in the soil and to transport and store nutrients within the plant. So if we look at the structure of roots in this cross section, so you've got the root hairs, which are extensions of the epidermis, the outside layer. Inside of that is a cortex. And then you have another layer of cells called an endodermis. And we'll talk about the role of those cells a bit later. And inside the endodermis is the vascular tissue, so the xylem and the phloem. So you can remember which is which because the xylem kind of forms an X-like structure, which is the letter that it starts with. You can also look at a root in a longitudinal section, so like this, and it has 4 different zones and zones of sort of what is occurring in those areas. So at the top, you have a zone of maturation. So cells are differentiating into different types of cells with various functions. Under that is a zone of elongation. So these cells are getting longer to force the root tip deeper into the soil. Below that is the meristematic region, which we've talked a little bit about before. So this is a region of rapid mitosis of undifferentiated meristematic cells. And then below that is the root cap, right? So this is a tough layer of cells that protect the meristematic region from abrasion as the root tip is digging deeper into the soil. So now if we talk about the function of the root, so it has a nutrient transport role, right? It has 3 transport functions. So it needs to absorb water that's needed by the leaves for photosynthesis. And there will also be water loss through transpiration that will need to be replaced to maintain that column of water that's heading up to the leaves. The roots also absorb dissolved minerals and regulate their quantity entering the rest of the plant. And now within the cortex of the root, there is starch that is stored there. So when there's extra glucose produced, it is transported as sucrose and then stored as starch in the cortex of the root. And so some of that food is used by the cells of the root for energy, and other parts of it will be transported to parts of the plant that need it. So how are the water and minerals absorbed by the roots? So the first thing is that a large surface area is needed in order for the absorption to be efficient. And so this is accomplished in 2 main ways for roots. So the roots are branched, right? So you might have noticed if you pull up roots, they're kind of going all over the place. And the roots are covered in root hairs, which are extensions of the epidermal cells surrounding the root. So those 2 things create a large surface area for absorption of water and minerals. Now, the minerals in the soil are actually in a really low concentration, probably lower concentration than inside the root, but the root still needs to take them up. So, in order to do that, it needs to use energy. They're not just going to diffuse in because there isn't a proper concentration gradient. So, they have to use energy, which is called active transport, to move those minerals into the root. And so before they can get into the root, they actually need to get to the root, right? They're all over the soil. So they need to move through the soil to the root, and this occurs in 3 main ways. So they can diffuse. So if there is a high concentration of mineral somewhere away from the root, it will make its way towards the root through diffusion. When water is flowing through the soil, it's going to be carrying mineral ions with it. Or if a plant has fungal hyphae growing around it, right, in a mutualistic relationship, then that fungus is going to help get the minerals from the soil and then transfer them into the roots. So when those substances are absorbed into the root, they're going to move into the cortex and head towards the vascular tissue in the center of the root. And they're going to come across the endodermis, right? So the vascular tissue is surrounded by that endodermis, and its role is to act as a filter. So it's going to only let required nutrients and water in. It's not going to let any harmful substances like toxins into the vascular tissue and then into the rest of the plant. So now looking at modified roots. So the one type of modified root we're going to look at is our storage roots, which you're probably pretty familiar with. So some roots become swollen in order to store more food, and they can be identified as roots because their vascular tissue is in the center, unlike the stems, which were in a ring. And so examples of storage roots are things like carrots and beets, and there's quite a lot of other examples. So that's the information that you need to know about stems and roots and their structure, function, and how they can be modified.